Hey, it's Dave Brown here, host of Now with Dave Brown on AMI. Check out this latest highlight from the show. It's been a busy few weeks for federal announcements about the Accessible Canada Act and the Disability Inclusion Action Plan. The government has made a commitment from the speech from the throne to create a plan that would include a national disability benefit, an employment strategy, and easier access to government services. Last week, our accessibility reporter, Meagan Gillmore, spoke with the Minister of Disability Inclusion, Carla Qualtrough, about these recent announcements, and Meagan joins us today with some audio clips from an interview with the minister. Hey, good morning, Meagan.
Good morning, Dave. How are you?
I'm well. Now, Meagan, I know you've got a lot here. Take your time with this because you've got a lot of important information. So let's start with this. What has the government announced recently?
So you can think of what we're talking about today as two big different announcements. So chronologically, the first one happened a couple weeks ago where the federal government announced that they are now accepting applications. Applications are now open to fill the roles of Chief Accessibility Commissioner and Chief Accessibility Officer under the Accessible Canada Act. So those are two main roles really when it comes to enforcement of the act. And now applications are open until June 24th or 28th, I believe. And then also last week, near the end of National Accessibility Awareness Week, the government began consultations for the Disability Inclusion Action Plan. So that was the Disability Inclusion Plan that was announced in the speech from the throne. The name has changed a little bit. It's now the Disability Action Inclusion Plan. If you've been keeping track at home, we're talking about the same thing.
I'll change my acronyms accordingly. Meagan, tell us a little bit more about these consultations. What are they hoping to achieve?
Sure. So it's an online consultation right now. It's just a survey asking all Canadians what they would like to see. And they're focusing on four main areas, being that would be financial security, employment, disability inclusive spaces, and a modern approach to disability and accessing disability services. That would be like government services and being able to access what you need from the government in terms of disability.
Meagan, I know this question seems self-evident, but why is this so important?
Right. So I posed that question to Minister Qualtrough as specifically asking her, why is it important for Canadians who perhaps don't have a disability to participate in this survey as well? And here's a bit of what she told me.
Standing by.
This has been a long time coming. You know, we went through the rigor of the country of doing accessible consultations, and we put in place this law, and now we've got the regulations up and running, and now people want action, and this is the action part. This is where we put in place actions to address systemic inequities and to address these ongoing barriers, you know, and really do it in the same spirit as with the Accessible Canada Act, in consultation, in working together with the disability community, really in the spirit of nothing without us. And we've got big goals, you know, reduce poverty, get people with disabilities into good quality jobs, help meet the Accessible Canada Act goal of barrier-free Canada by 2040, and make it easier for a person with disabilities to access federal programs and services. And then the big one is just foster the culture change that we all so desperately want.
So, Meagan, when does this consultation period come to an end?
This part, the online survey, ends on August 31st, but there will be more rounds of consultation. So when I was speaking to the minister, the word that she said a lot was evergreen. I know we've spoken on this program about how in this most recent federal budget, the government committed money over 3 years for consultations. Right now, the idea is that those consultations may go beyond the 3 years. That this will be an ongoing process, and as more issues arise, they'll address them in future rounds of consultation, whether that's surveys or in-person consultations. There'll be more methods of consultation that will be announced hopefully soon. And it's just important to know, because I know consultation can be long and it can be easy to lose patience. One of the things that could come out of this, that we're hoping comes out of this, is a national disability benefit that will require cooperation from provinces and territories. That is not an easy thing to get in the federation that we have. So there's a reason why we need lots of time for this.
Who would the government like to fill out the online survey?
Right. So I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. I messed up saying that last clip there, but really anyone. And I asked the minister specifically about, what about people who don't have disabilities and who we may not be thinking as the target group for this? What about, like what if somebody's family members or their friends wanted to fill this out? And here's what she said about why any Canadian should consider filling out the survey.
For the same reason, because that someone with a disability would, because they will benefit from a more accessible and inclusive Canada. They will benefit from their communities they live in having, being accessible and open to everybody to participate in the way that they want to in society. Because everybody benefits when a community, a workplace, or just society writ large is disability inclusive.
Now let's move over to the announcements about the Accessible Canada Act. The government announced it's accepting applications for 2 different positions. So what did the minister have to say about the Chief Accessibility Commissioner role?
Sure. So the Chief Accessibility Commissioner role is a little different in the sense of where it's housed in the government. So it may be a little trickier to find the information about it. So this is how Minister of Culture explained where the Accessibility Commissioner is going to work and how that impacts the Accessible Canada Act.
The Accessibility Commissioner is going to be housed in the Canadian Human Rights Commission and lead their new accessibility unit there, and really is focused on promoting compliance with the Act and ensuring that federally regulated businesses like banks and telecoms and the federal government itself meet their accessibility obligations as the regulations get and standards get developed and finalized. So it also will perform, he or she also will perform the role of investigating and ruling on any complaints that are filed under the Act.
As mentioned, there are 2 roles here. So we also have the Chief Accessibility Officer role. What about that role?
Right. So this role is a little different, whereas the Chief Accessibility Commissioner, as we just heard, is housed in the Human Rights Commission of Canada. The Chief Accessibility Officer is more located within the department of the government that the Minister of Disability Inclusion works in. So this is the clip of Minister Carla Qualtrough explaining more what the Chief Accessibility Officer's role is in this process.
Well, the Chief Accessibility Officer has more of a systemic role to play in the whole ecosystem that the Accessible Canada Act has created. So that individual will report directly to the minister. Right now, that would be me. But it's an enshrined position. Whoever plays the function I play, they'll report to that person and advise the minister on systemic or emerging accessibility issues. So looking at the entire system that the Accessible Canada Act is creating or the barriers that are still existent, really advising the minister, hey, you better take a look at X, this is happening. And also this person will monitor and report on outcomes achieved by the Accessible Canada Act. So once a year, this individual has to submit a report to the minister, and then the minister will file that report in the House of Commons. So creating kind of a public record of outcomes, advancements, where there have been challenges, so that every year there's a report tabled in the House of Commons.
Meagan, as we've discussed before, the Accessible Canada Act only applies to entities under federal jurisdiction, but we know there are lots of barriers in areas like education, healthcare, things that are under provincial jurisdiction. How will these positions help with that?
Yeah, it's an excellent question because even when, for example, if you were to read the most recent annual report from the Human Rights Commission of Canada, when they talk about disability issues particularly, which they do for several pages of that report, they're related to things like healthcare and our long-term care system, which are provincial jurisdiction. Or we talk about challenges people face in education, especially during a pandemic. And again, that's provincial jurisdiction. So I think that's where it can be a little tricky for people because, hey, if a law sounds so good, but if there's a law, why am I not seeing change out my front door, where I live? So I posed that question to the minister, and this is what she said about how these roles relate to things like education or healthcare or other sectors that are within provincial jurisdiction.
Really important question, and I would say indirectly, yes, because of course we have the Canada Health Act and we do fund post-secondary education institutes. So For example, say if we had, which we do, we have a program where we fund post-secondary institutions. The accessibility officer could look at that program and say, you don't have a sufficient funding for students with disabilities. But it would be only insofar as the federal government has a role to play in something that the chief accessibility officer would be able to actually oversee that. Now, in terms of engagement and influence and leadership and convening, all that would happen just like we've tried to do through the pandemic, even though we only have, the ability to engage and convene, but that's a pretty powerful voice.
Right.
If the Chief Accessibility Officer of Canada goes into a conversation, people will listen. They don't have to do what they're told, but I wouldn't underestimate the power that this person may, or the influence this person may ultimately have in a broader area of issues related to disability. The exciting part of this is this has never been done before. So we get to kind of do it like we're going to learn as we go along.
Meagan, the applications for these positions are now open, but when are these positions expected to be filled?
They're hoping for the end of this calendar year, perhaps even as early as the fall, which is a pretty ambitious timeline. So, but that is the hope.
Does someone need to have a disability to fill the position?
That is not, from what I understand, a 100% requirement, but lived experience with disability is a very important factor that will be considered highly in the hiring process.
Now, Meagan, a few months ago, you reported on the first regulations that have been announced under the Accessible Canada Act, and those are regulations that the Chief Accessibility Commissioner and officer will be enforcing. So how does the timeline for filling these roles fit with the timeline of implementing these regulations?
Right, that's a good question. There's a lot of trains on different tracks going on right now.
No pun intended.
Yeah, no pun intended at all. So I'm just going to let the minister explain how these positions relate to the passing and implementation of the upcoming regulations.
It actually dovetails quite nicely because the first set of regulations are set under the Accessible Canada Act are set to be finalized at the end of this year. And those ones actually form the kind of backbone of the regulatory scheme that we're kind of following. So that federally regulated entities have to have accessibility plans, the feedback process on progress, the framework for administrative monetary penalties. There's these kind of nuts and bolts of running an organization and having compliance and all the mechanisms to actually enforce this act. That's what this first wave of regs addresses, including, now the Accessibility Commissioner can go out first day on the job pretty much and start, telling employers, but, businesses, federally regulated entities, what they need to do. They need to get these plans. Here's what the plan looks like. Here's how long you have to create it. So it dovetails very nicely with when the first batch of regs is coming into place.
Meagan, these positions are important. Where can people find out more?
Right. So there's a couple ways you can do this. The easy way is to go to the Now with Dave Brown blog, where we will have those links available for you.
AMI.ca/nowblog, AMI.ca/nowblog.
Yes, or you can have the thrill of searching for this in the government's website. So if you are looking for the applications for the Chief Accessibility Officer or Chief Accessibility Commissioner because you would like to apply, or encourage someone to apply, you want to look up GIC appointment opportunities, and then you're going to search through the table. Chief Accessibility Commissioner, you're going to search for things that fall under the Human Rights Commission of Canada. And then for the Chief Accessibility Officer, you're going to look for things that fall under the Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion Department of the government. It is, just to make this abundantly clear, these are full-time paid positions with six-figure salaries, and that's all listed there. So there's like applying for another job. And then the link for the consultation survey, which may be more relevant. Again, that's at the Now with Dave Brown blog, and a lot of accessibility organizations have been tweeting out about this in the past few days. It's open until August 31st. That won't be your last chance to give input, but that is the first.
AMI.ca/nowblog is where you find out more. Meagan, thank you for doing this for us. We really appreciate the thorough work on this one.
No problem. Have a great day.
That's Meagan Gillmore. She is our accessibility reporter. Do you want to dive into more conversations like this? Watch Now with Dave Brown weekdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on AMI TV or download the podcasts wherever you listen.